Before we begin, make sure you like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications because stories like this deserve to be remembered properly. For nearly 20 years, Mark Harmon wasn't just starring in a television series. He was the series. NCIS wasn't something audiences simply watched every week. It was something they felt. And at the center of that feeling was Leroy Jethro Gibbs, quiet, controlled, and emotionally sealed off from the world. Harmon never needed loud monologues or dramatic speeches to command attention. He carried authority in silence. So when he stepped away, it didn't feel like an actor leaving a job. It felt like gravity disappearing from a room. Fans didn't just ask where Gibbs went. They asked why. What could push someone so deeply tied to a role to finally let it go? This isn't a story about scandal or conflict. It's a story about endurance, responsibility, and the hidden cost of staying strong for too long. And the truth behind Mark Harmon's exit is far more human than most people realize. When NCIS first appeared on television, no one imagined it would grow into one of the longest-running dramas in TV history. It wasn't designed to be flashy or revolutionary. It was procedural, grounded, and slow by design. Leroy Jethro Gibbs was introduced quietly through JAG, and even then he didn't scream icon. He was reserved, emotionally distant, and shaped by grief long before viewers knew his full story. But that restraint became the show's heartbeat. Gibbs didn't explain himself. He didn't seek approval, and that made him feel real. Mark Harmon understood this instinctively. From the very beginning, he approached the role with discipline instead of ego. He stripped the character down to his essentials: silence, repetition, control. Over time, that approach defined NCIS itself. The show didn't rely on spectacle. It relied on presence. And that presence came from Harmon's ability to hold a room without raising his voice. As seasons passed, audiences stopped separating the actor from the character. Gibbs didn't feel written. He felt lived in. Behind the scenes, however, that authenticity came at a cost. NCIS followed a production schedule few actors can maintain for long. Long days became normal. Early call times, late wrap hours, and constant physical and emotional demands were part of the routine. As the lead, Harmon wasn't just performing. He was anchoring every storyline. Every scene depended on his availability, his consistency, and his energy. And unlike many leading actors, Harmon didn't step back once cameras stopped rolling. He became deeply involved as an executive producer, protecting the tone of the show and the integrity of Gibbs. He cared about discipline on set, continuity in storytelling, and loyalty to the crew. That sense of responsibility kept him there year after year. Even when cast members changed and familiar faces left, Harmon stayed. Not because it was easy, but because he believed the show deserved stability. What audiences saw as commitment was, in reality, endurance slowly turning into exhaustion. Mark Harmon later admitted that from the very first day, NCIS demanded more than he expected. He recalled early shoots that stretched far beyond reason, sometimes lasting close to 20 hours. At the time, he accepted it. The show was growing and the work felt meaningful. But those days didn't disappear with success. They became routine. And over years, that routine took a physical and mental toll. Harmon wasn't chasing fame or security. He stayed because he believed in keeping Gibbs honest. But playing a character built on grief, control, and emotional isolation for nearly 2 decades carries weight. That weight doesn't vanish when the director yells cut. It follows you home. It settles into your body. And eventually, it asks to be acknowledged. Harmon never complained publicly. He never dramatized the struggle. But that silence mirrored Gibbs himself, a man who carries pain quietly until it becomes too heavy to ignore. As the years passed, the boundary between Mark Harmon and Leroy Jethro Gibbs began to blur. Both were defined by restraint. Both carried responsibility without asking for recognition. And both stayed longer than was healthy because they believed others depended on them. Harmon has said that what kept him returning wasn't habit, but honesty. He didn't want Gibbs to become a caricature of himself. He wanted the character to evolve truthfully, but evolution requires energy. And eventually, that energy began to fade. The workload never eased, the expectations never lowered, and the emotional cost of staying present, not just physically but creatively, became harder to justify. This wasn't burnout in the dramatic sense. It was accumulation. Years of saying yes when the body and mind were quietly asking for rest. By the time NCIS entered its second decade, the show no longer felt like a job. It felt like an obligation that never switched off. Harmon wasn't just playing Gibbs. He was protecting a machine that relied on him showing up without fail. That kind of pressure doesn't arrive loudly. It settles in slowly, disguising itself as routine. Exhaustion becomes normal. Fatigue becomes familiar. And you don't notice how tired you are until stopping becomes an option. Harmon later admitted that he was simply tired. Not bored, not resentful, just worn down. And acknowledging that truth didn't come easily for someone who built a career on discipline and endurance. Age also changed the equation. As Harmon approached his 70s, the physical demands of the role became impossible to ignore. Gibbs wasn't a passive character. He stood for long hours, endured action sequences, and carried constant tension. Even silence required energy. Harmon recognized that continuing without consequence would no longer feel truthful. At the same time, his priorities outside the show shifted. Time with his wife and children stopped being something he wanted to schedule around production. It became essential. The question was no longer whether NCIS could survive without Gibbs. It was whether Harmon could continue without losing something irreplaceable. What makes this story especially powerful is that there was no dramatic breaking point. No scandal. No explosion. Just a gradual realization that staying out of habit would eventually erode the honesty Harmon valued most. And for an actor who built a character on truth rather than spectacle, that mattered deeply. When discussions about an exit began, Harmon wasn't running away. He was preparing to let go carefully, without damaging what he helped build. That intention shaped everything that followed. Gibbs' on-screen exit reflected that same restraint. There was no heroic death or formal retirement. Instead, the episode Great Wide Open sent Gibbs to Alaska, a place defined by isolation and quiet reflection. He didn't return. He stayed. No speeches, no final badge, just stillness. Harmon later explained that this choice mattered. Gibbs wasn't healed. He wasn't finished. He was simply choosing not to carry the weight anymore. The fishing scene with Magee captured everything Gibbs never said out loud. Gratitude, trust, respect. It was quiet, restrained, and deeply emotional. For some fans, it felt incomplete. For Harmon, it felt honest. Life doesn't always give closure. Sometimes it gives distance. And that distance can be healing. After Gibbs' quiet exit, the producers made a choice that spoke volumes without saying a word. Mark Harmon's name remained in the opening credits long after he stopped appearing on screen. For casual viewers, it may have seemed like a technical detail. But for longtime fans, it carried emotional weight. It felt like a promise that Gibbs was still out there somewhere, still part of the world, still watching from a distance. That credit wasn't about contracts. It was about respect. About acknowledging that NCIS, at its core, was still built on the foundation Harmon laid. His influence lingered in the packing of scenes, in the way silence was allowed to breathe, in the refusal to rush emotional moments. Even without his physical presence, the show still carried his fingerprints. And for a time, that was enough. It softened the loss. It gave viewers space to adjust. But eventually, even that quiet reassurance would disappear. When Mark Harmon's name was finally removed from the opening credits, the impact hit harder than many expected. There was no announcement, no tribute episode, just absence. And that absence felt heavier than any dramatic farewell could have. For nearly 2 decades, audiences had associated that name with stability. Seeing it gone made the departure feel permanent in a way the Alaska episode never did. It was the moment many fans realized that Gibbs wasn't just on a break. An era had ended. The rhythm of the show felt different. The pauses were shorter. The silence felt less intentional. NCIS was still functioning, still telling stories, but something essential had shifted. Not broken, just changed. And change, even when necessary, carries grief. That slow removal mirrored Harmon's real-life decision. He didn't slam the door. He stepped back gradually, allowing space for both the show and the audience to adjust. Audience reaction to Gibbs' absence was deeply emotional and often personal. This wasn't the kind of departure that sparked outrage or controversy. Instead, it sparked something quieter and harder to process: mourning. Fans spoke about watching NCIS out of habit, only to realize something felt wrong. Others stopped watching altogether, not out of anger, but because the show reminded them of what was missing. Gibbs wasn't just a character. He was routine, comfort, a familiar presence at the end of long days. His leadership style wasn't flashy, but it felt safe. He didn't dominate scenes. He anchored them. Without him, the show had to redefine its emotional center. And while new characters brought fresh energy, none were meant to replace him. NCIS didn't try to recreate Gibbs because it couldn't. Instead, it moved forward with the visible imprint of someone who could never truly be replicated. Behind the camera, the emotional weight of Harmon's departure was just as real. For cast members who had grown up on the show, his presence had been constant. Sean Murray, who played Magee, had spent nearly his entire adult career working alongside Harmon. Their relationship wasn't just scripted. It was built through years of shared work, quiet mentorship, and mutual trust. When Murray later spoke about filming their final scene together, his words carried raw emotion. It wasn't just a goodbye between characters. It was a farewell between two people whose professional lives had been deeply intertwined. The restraint of that scene made it even more powerful. No tears, no speeches, just understanding. That kind of goodbye only works when it's real. What made Harmon's exit harder for fans to process was the absence of a clear reason to blame. There was no network dispute, no creative meltdown, no public conflict, just a man reaching the limits of what he could give. And that reality is uncomfortable. It forces viewers to confront something we rarely acknowledge, that even the strongest, most disciplined people have breaking points. That endurance isn't infinite. Gibbs had always embodied control. He survived loss by locking it away and moving forward. Watching Harmon step away forced fans to recognize that this approach, while admirable, comes at a cost. And eventually, that cost must be paid. For a long time after leaving, Mark Harmon chose silence. He didn't explain himself. He didn't justify his decision. That restraint felt familiar, almost comforting. It echoed Gibbs himself, a man who never explained unless necessary. But when Harmon finally spoke openly, years later, his honesty surprised many. He admitted that exhaustion played a bigger role than he had ever let on. Not dramatic burnout, not resentment, just years of accumulated fatigue, early mornings, late nights, emotional control, constant responsibility, leading not just on screen but behind the scenes. It all added up, and pretending otherwise would have meant denying his own limits. Harmon described his departure in a way that revealed his mindset perfectly. He didn't say he left. He said he pushed away. That distinction matters. Leaving implies finality. Pushing away suggests space, breathing room, a pause rather than an ending. The writers shaped Gibbs' exit to reflect that philosophy. Alaska wasn't a retirement. It was distance. A place where the character could exist without expectations, where he didn't have to perform strength anymore. That choice allowed Gibbs to remain intact, rather than forcing an ending that felt dishonest. And that honesty mattered more to Harmon than spectacle ever could. One of the most telling aspects of Harmon's reflections is the absence of bitterness. He never criticized the show, never blamed the schedule publicly, never distanced himself from the people involved. Instead, he expressed gratitude. Gratitude for the longevity, gratitude for the audience, gratitude for the rare opportunity to build something that lasted. He understood how unusual it is for a network series to survive as long as NCIS has. And he understood that its survival required sacrifice. His decision to step back wasn't rejection. It was preservation of himself and of the character. Harmon's continued involvement as an executive producer confirmed what many fans already felt. He never truly left. He simply changed his relationship to the story. That became even clearer with NCIS, Origins. Rather than returning physically as Gibbs, Harmon chose to narrate, to guide the story from the edges. It was a perfect evolution. Gibbs had always been more presence than performance, more weight than words. By stepping into a voiceover role, Harmon honored the character's essence without reopening the door he had carefully closed. It allowed the legacy to continue without undoing the goodbye. In the end, Mark Harmon didn't walk away from NCIS because he stopped caring. He walked away because caring demanded more than he could continue giving. And that truth is what makes his exit so powerful. Gibbs stayed as long as he did because he believed others needed him. Harmon stayed for the same reason. But knowing when to stop, when to choose yourself without destroying what you built, is its own form of strength. His departure wasn't dramatic, it was honest. And in a world of forced endings and manufactured exits, that honesty is rare. So now the question remains, did Mark Harmon make the right choice by stepping away when he did, or should Gibbs have stayed longer? Share your thoughts below, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay with us for more stories that changed television forever.